And today's webinar is by Dr. John Vargo of the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And the title is Building Organizational Resilience in the Face of Systematic Insecurity in a Complex and Interconnected World. John and I have a common interest in natural disaster research, but the insecurity and resilience crosses all kinds of layers of things, not just natural disasters, but economic shocks, etc. So I'm really pleased to have him give a webinar today, and John is the co-leader and director of Resilient Organizations Ltd, hosted at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. His interests focus on organizational resilience in the face of systematic insecurity in a complex and interconnected world. The Resilient Orgs group has been researching organizational resilience since 2004 and has been heavily involved in research following the 2010-11 series of devastating earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand. His research looked at the impacts of the earthquakes on organizations and economic sectors, and the application of Resilient Org's 13 indicator resilience model for systematic recovery. So really glad to have you, John. And we have a few participants here, and hopefully we'll have a few more join. We're also recording, and we'll make this webinar available in that format as well. And maybe I'll stop here, and John, you can take over for the participants. If you should have any questions along the way, I think you know how to type in the chat section there, and you can ask your questions, and John will get to them either along the way or near the end. So John, why don't you go ahead and take over?
Organizational resilience. First of all, just a little bit more about myself. You might think, oh, John, you don't sound like you're a New Zealander. That's because I'm originally from Detroit, which might explain it. So I'm a hometown boy in some ways with the North Central Regional Center, in the sense that Michigan is one of your 12 states. But I have lived in New Zealand for over 30 years, so we've been here for a long time. I'll kick things off. Before I get too far, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that today is Pearl Harbor Day for you. Now I'm a day ahead, so it's December 8th in the morning here, and it's the 7th in the afternoon for you. But that event, along with the likes of 9/11, are something to be remembered, acknowledged, and certainly a major cause of change in our world. And to a considerable extent, that's what I will be talking about today. It's often been said that there are two certain things in life. I'm sure you've heard that: death and taxes. I'd assert that there's a third, and that is change. Change caused by a wide range of things. It could be an event, geopolitical event like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or some other. It could be a flood, and I know flooding is not unknown in your territories. It could be like we experienced here in Christchurch back in 2010 and 11, and even more recently, just a couple of earlier, I was going to say this month, but it's last month in mid-November, there was a major earthquake, fortunately not in Christchurch, but in the region north of Christchurch. This picture you're looking at here is a photograph of downtown Christchurch immediately within moments after our big earthquake in February 2011. All of that stuff you see in the air is a consequence of collapsing buildings and liquefaction and dust being thrown in the air because of the violence of the earthquake. Other things that can cause change for us, certainly uncontrolled people movements, as we've been seeing in Europe as a result of the war in Syria, the global financial collapse in 2008 with ramifications still being felt today. It could be technologies. So some things are natural disasters, some are man-made, some will have benefits, others wide detriments. And it's this combination of changes that I'd really like to talk about why it's important that we become more resilient as organizations and as individuals and communities. I guess in the light of all of these kinds of changes, I'd just ask you all a question, and that is, how many of you believe that our future will be more stable and less turbulent than our past? If you could put your hand up and say, yeah, I think we're looking at a more stable and less turbulent future. Taylor, you still got your hand up, but I don't think you really mean that. The interesting thing about this question is that, thanks, Taylor, is that I think most people think the future is looking like a high change future, a future that is looking turbulent, often a bit scary, more so for some people than for others. And it's this future that we're having to face one way or the other that we need to prepare ourselves for. And myself and my colleagues at Resilient Organizations believe a critical characteristic in that preparation for the future is building resilience, especially in the context of organizational resilience, which is the way I'll be speaking about it. When I talk about an organization, really I'm using this term in the most broad sense. It could be any small group up to a very large group. So it could be a small rural farm or non-farm business. It could be a multinational. It could be a government department. It could be a local club for that matter. And our research has encompassed a very wide range. And you'll hear some stories over these next 20 or 25 minutes from me about some of those people that we've worked with. Always useful to know what we mean by resilience. We've been working in this space now for 12, going on 13 years. We know there are a lot of different definitions of resilience out there. Our definition has gained a reasonable amount of traction, especially in the organizational resilience space. And it's a simple definition. We said, well, let's come up with a definition that's easy to understand, that's straightforward for people to grab hold of. It has two pieces to it. First piece is the ability to survive a crisis. So this has to do with when something really bad happens. It might be a flood for you or a fire, could be a collapse in part of your supply chain. It could be some geopolitical occurrence. It could be a national election like the US has just been through. And regardless of which side of the coin you're on, I think the US will be in for quite a lot of change under a Trump presidency, for good or less so, remains to be seen yet, I suppose. And I'm sure you'll all have your own views on that. The second part of our definition is about business as usual. So the first half, the ability to survive a crisis, is about being in the middle of some very challenging situation for your organization. The second part really is about day to day. It's about business as usual. How do you go about thriving in a world that's changing faster than you think you can keep up with? How do you become the kind of organization that can find the opportunities in spite of the rapid changes and turbulence that we're experiencing? Part of the answer to that question is looking beyond the risk to see the opportunities. So risk management, obviously an important characteristic for organizations of any kind, looking to see what's coming at us and how we'll respond to it. But often the perspective that we as humans bring to this tends to center around how do we either prevent the thing from happening or how do we make the best of it from the standpoint of mitigating any losses and difficulties. Often, though, we miss the perspective of in the midst of a major change, in the midst of a crisis, often there are opportunities that present themselves, but they often go unheeded, and we don't take the opportunity to grab hold of the positives that could be there as well. Let me give you a specific example of a place that addressed this themselves. Many of you will be familiar with Sydney, Australia. Some of you may have had the pleasure of visiting one of the world's great large cities. Sydney is the financial heart of Australia and the largest city in Australia, just ahead of Melbourne. During the 2000s, from about 2001 until 2010, not just Sydney, but all of Australia went through their worst drought in their country's history. So Australia has existed as a country for about not quite 200 years, probably pushing the direction of 200 years. And this is their worst drought in recorded history. Their rainfall in most of the country dropped to between 10 and 20% of normal and continued that way for almost a decade. What you're looking at here is part of the riverbed of the Murray River, which is the primary source of water for the city of Sydney. So they were getting pretty close to serious trouble in Sydney during that period. Big risk, big problem. They knew they faced this risk because Australia is a very dry place anyhow, and why 90% of the population is located along the coastal areas where there is more water. Did they have an opportunity? Well, they did, and they decided they were going to take hold of that opportunity with a big vision, and that was to increase their water security. What you're looking at here is a desalination plant, which Sydney had been talking about for the previous couple of decades, but had done nothing about. But now they had both the impetus, the opportunity, and the support from the community to install a major desalination plant. This plant has the capacity, it is finished now and functioning, has been for the better part of 4, 5, 6 years. And they decided that by building this, increasing their water security, they'd be able to supply all of the fundamental water that was necessary to keep the city running in a crisis. Now, they pitched that at about 30% of their total water supply, that they could conserve down to about 30% and still function. And that's what this plant is capable of providing. Right now, it provides 15% and can double its capacity to 30% fairly quickly because all of the infrastructure is in place. That was a technology decision because they recognize that technology in this arena is improving year by year. They had a major risk. They took the opportunity, and their water security is dramatically better. Desalination of water is an expensive process from an energy standpoint. As part of this, they also took the opportunity to maintain a strength in that space and installed a large solar array that will drive this plant completely. Well, does drive this plant completely. And of course, we all know that that's a major technology that is not only on the horizon, but has arrived in many places. I guess what this underlines is part of our view on what makes organizations resilient. Yes, planning is an important feature of that, but equally important, actually, we consider more important, and I'll describe to you the reasons why, building adaptive capacity. Planning will deal with those things that are foreseeable. Unfortunately, many of the things that are coming our way are only partially foreseeable. We may know what the technology is, but its impact, for example, we may not know. Christchurch didn't know that we had an earthquake coming our way that was going to devastate our city starting 6 years ago. It was a 1 in 2,500 year event. If you've heard that kind of language, what it means, it's the sort of earthquake that you would only expect to happen in Christchurch in a particular location once in 2,500 years. So it was a very unexpected event. If you've heard the term black swan, this term is sometimes used for these very high impact but very low probability events happening. You can plan for some things. Christchurch couldn't plan for that because they didn't expect it to happen. So we need to learn to adapt. And that brings me to the model, what we sometimes refer to as the 13 indicator model of organizational resilience that we've developed over these last 12 or 13 years. It starts with 3 primary attributes. You can see these three attributes on your screen here. You can see the first one and the most important of the three, leadership and culture. And I'll talk about the indicators related to each of these in a moment. The networks that the organization has and the extent to which that your organization or the organization you might want to help is ready for change. To look at this in a little bit more detail, we have the 13 indicators related to each of these. The most important of these indicators is the leadership indicator. And the reason we know that it's the most important is because this indicator, the quality and type of leadership that your organization or an organization that you want to help is so important in building resilience, is the leadership has the capability for either enabling all of the rest of these indicators or disabling them. Let's look at the other indicators related to leadership and culture. Staff engagement, to the extent that your staff trust you and believe that you have their best interest in mind and they want to put their best efforts into your organization. The quality of your decision making, the speed of your decision making. How aware are you of what's going on in your environment, both internally and externally? Do you know what your people think? The quality of your products and services? Are you in touch? Is the organization you want to help in touch? What about externally? Do they understand what government policies changes might have impact on them? What about competitors, collaborators, their supply chain? So situation awareness and innovation and creativity. Are they a learning organization or are they a stagnant organization? Then on networks. Networks include a range, both internal and external indicators. Effective partnerships, primarily dealing with those external networks. Effective partnerships could include your supply chain, could include your customer base in suppliers, could include even your competitors, because at times those are the people you might turn to for help when there's really something horrible happening. It may be affecting all of people within a given industry. But your partnerships could also include your connections to the local media, local government, central government, and the list goes on, really. Also included here are your, within your networks, are your internal resources. How well resourced is your organization for maintaining partnerships? Are the internal resources, can they move where they're needed within the organization? Or are they badly siloed? And so breaking silos is an important characteristic of resilience. The more that ideas, solutions, people, and resources can flow from one part of the organization to the part where they're most needed, the more resilient the organization is going to be. And leveraging knowledge. Do you know what other people know within your organization? Is that knowledge shared? Are you able to marry it up with your internal resources in order to be more creative and more innovative? And then being change ready, which has two primary pieces to it. One is a proactive posture. Are the people within your organization looking for where they can help, or are they just responding to what's happening? Are they keeping their eyes open with good situation awareness? And is there a culture of action and communication to the leadership so good decisions can be made? So you can see these pieces, even though in this two-dimensional model, it looks like they're all separate pieces. They are quite connected to one another. Related to that is unity of purpose. Do the people and elements within the organization have a common sense of direction, or they all have their own agendas? Are they heading off in slightly different directions that aren't unified? And then finally, we have the planning aspects of being change ready. Planning strategies certainly would include strategic planning, operational planning, but also include risk and business continuity and other such planning. But the important part of these planning strategies from a resilience standpoint is they'd be effectually built and that they be well integrated with one another, which is often not the case within both large and small organizations. And then stress testing those plans. It's one thing to have a plan that sits on a shelf. It's another thing to test it from time to time to make sure it'll stand up to scrutiny when something requires its need. So those are our 13 indicators. We've found that this model provides significant insight when you're thinking about how would I improve my ability to manage in a crisis and thrive in this uncertain world. If you put it into the context of this earlier diagram, this planned versus adaptive characteristics to build greater resilience, if you take that 13 indicator model, these two characteristics or indicators, stress testing plans and planning strategies, those two are the two that are related to the planned side of that model. Virtually all the rest are related to adaptive capacity. So you can see why we think adaptive capacity is so important, both from a short-term change and agility standpoint, as well as from a long-term learning standpoint where you need to adapt to something significant. So to the extent that climate change is going to have a large impact on organizations that you want to help, the adaptive capacity is quite an important feature of that. I give you another perspective. A colleague of ours named Robert Kay, he's an Australian who we've worked with, conducted a series of studies with 51 CEOs in Australia, basically asked them, what do you think resilience is all about? What makes organizations more resilient? One of his questions was, what do CEOs think builds resilience? And risk management people and business continuity people would have said business continuity planning or risk planning. What these CEOs said was scenarios and simulations to help us think about the future. Training, so people are prepared to move and to adapt. High quality communication, good strategic planning, making sure we're complying with the regulations that we have in place. Agreement with our stakeholders, which would include their boards of directors, shareholders, suppliers, customers, even their competitors. Business continuity planning featured, but you can see it isn't the major issue. Who do CEOs think build resilience? The view of these CEOs was the HR department. In other words, they thought it's the people that matter. It's the people who build resilience. The HR department's responsible for the people. The board consists of the high-level governance people. The staff are the people. So the top three all have to do with the people in the organization. So that's a critical aspect. Business continuity planning features highly in terms of who, they're business continuity people, making sure the business continues to function after a crisis, but also technical specialists, being a member of an industry association and working with those people, oftentimes competitors. Leadership from elsewhere, people that you might rely on for advice, and compliance. So these pieces are tied together, but we can see it's the people side that's the most important aspect in the view of those 51 CEOs. So I guess in some ways what I'm saying is planning is important. It is important, and it's particularly important for some organizations more than others. We've worked quite a lot with critical infrastructure organizations like water companies, power, telecommunications, roading, and so forth, especially in the aftermath of the Christchurch earthquakes, and building more resilient culture and resilient infrastructure in New Zealand as a whole. But one of the things that's become clear is that planning is very important for these large infrastructure organizations, but adaptive capacity is still critical. So how do we change the way we plan? And a key way of thinking about that is a quote that you may have heard from Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States during the 1950s, and leader of the troops as we took Europe back from the Nazis during World War II. His view was that plans are worthless, but planning is everything, which sounds a bit bizarre. How can plans be worthless and planning be everything? And of course, if you stop to think about it, you'll understand. Because the plan is a static report. It's something that often goes on a shelf. It may go on a server. People may have a copy in their drawer. Rarely are they poring over that plan unless they're the one who's writing it. But the process of planning involves people. It involves people getting together and thinking outside the box, thinking about the future and how things may come their way and how we might respond to them. And it's that process of planning that stimulates fresh thinking. And so from that standpoint, I certainly agree with Dwight Eisenhower. Let me give you a specific example. What you're looking at here is a power substation in the city of Christchurch. Our power company, they're called Orion, in the 1990s, so we're talking about 15 years before our earthquake struck in the mid-1990s, there was a report that was written by a bunch of academics that looked at the likelihood of a big earthquake hitting Christchurch and what its impact would be. And they concluded there would be quite a strong impact. There would be a lot of problems from liquefaction. If you're not sure what liquefaction is, it's when the shaking starts to happen, the water and the very small soil particles rise to the surface. And so you end up with this flooding mixed with all this muddy stuff. Where the problem comes, of course, is this has come from underground, which creates voids under the ground. As a consequence, buildings sink into those voids, the roads collapse into the holes that make the roads impassable, and we had a lot of that happen in Christchurch. That's what was being forecast by this report called Risk and Realities in the mid-1990s, and Orion said, we need to pay attention to this. And they looked at their network, including their substations, of which they have hundreds around Christchurch. And they said, in a big earthquake and with that level of liquefaction, we're going to lose most of our power and we're not going to get it back online for months. So we need to do something now about it. And over the ensuing about 10 or 12 years, they spent $6 million. And you can see what they've done with this particular substation. They've done earthquake strengthening with these external pillars, because previous to that, it was what we call unreinforced masonry building, just cinder block, no concrete or steel inside of the cinder block, in a building that would probably collapse if it weren't strengthened. So they did these external pillars with steel, which would give a bit of flexibility here, beams across the top, and they did this all over Christchurch, spent $6 million. As a consequence, when the earthquake struck, what we ended up with was our power coming back on in most of the city within a day, not months. They've estimated with external advisories that they've saved $60 million, invested $6 million and saved $60 million of repairs that they would have had to do if the earthquakes hadn't happened, when the earthquakes happened. So that's a big return on investment, I guess, as part of the picture in terms of both planning and creating adaptive capacity. So what do we need? How do we change our planning? We need to spend more time in our planning helping us adapt to our future expected environments. Let me give you an example of a group that we worked with that decided they were going to plan in order to adapt. This group of organizations is called the Bay of Plenty Lifelines Group. That is what those initials stand for. Bay of Plenty is a region within New Zealand, so it could be like a county, but probably would be more like a state in the US. And the Bay of Plenty Lifelines Group, by Lifelines Group, they are the groups of organizations responsible for critical infrastructure. So again, they include the water companies, the power, telecommunications, roading, and so forth. There are about 20 of them in the Bay of Plenty Lifelines group, and they asked us to come in and help them measure their organizational resilience individually and as a group, and help them think about how they could improve their adaptive capacity and their resilience going forward. This graph that you're looking at is a measure of their individual resilience. So this rainbow chart down at the bottom shows you those organizations here in the red. That's this group. There were two out of the 20 who didn't score that well on our tool. We have a tool for measuring organizational resilience. You can see the majority were in this yellow space, which is about average compared to our database of organizations who've completed various versions of our survey. You can see there's this small group of 3 who are right at the green end. They're looking pretty fantastic. So they thought, okay, well, we have this information. How will this help us improve our adaptive capacity as both individual organizations, but also as a group of organizations who are dependent on one another in various ways? This graph shows you how they performed on our 13 indicators. So you can see the 13 indicators across the bottom. Here's leadership, staff engagement, and so forth through to planning strategies and stress testing plans. If you haven't seen a graph like this before, let me describe to you how it works. I'll take this one down at the end with stress testing plans. This little bar here in the middle indicates what the average or median, more specifically, score was. And the length of these, what they call whiskers, indicates how much difference of opinion there was between the 20 organizations. And you can see there was a very wide difference of views. Some organizations very strong and some very weak. And it's actually the one with the most spread. And it's also one of the weakest ones. If you follow it across the line, that one, this one, which is breaking silos, and this one, which is innovation and creativity, were their 3 lowest as a group of 20. Their single highest one was this one here, effective partnerships. Still a reasonable spread of resilience on this particular indicator, but you can see it's the highest one by a significant margin over the rest. What does this mean in terms of improving the resilience of these organizations individually or as groups? Well, as a result of them doing this study with us, each of these 20 organizations got a report showing their own scores. Here you're seeing summary scores of the 20, but they each got a report showing their own scores and some recommendations on how they could improve their resilience in their weakest areas and also how to use their strengths to leverage improvements in their resilience. What did they do specifically as a group? Well, what they decided they were going to do was take their 2 greatest weaknesses and work on them, breaking silos and stress testing plans. And the way they were going to do that was by taking their biggest strength and use it to overcome the other 2. And as a group, the 20 plus organizations decided to take their capacity as effective partnerships to work with one another, a partnership, in order to break silos between them, because we also help them look at the interdependencies between their organizations and where things could go wrong as a result of somebody else's failure impacting on their ability to deliver their service. So the failure of power, for example, would have a direct impact on the water company's ability to deliver water to their communities. So breaking those silos down and allow them also to build joint plans, which they're actually pretty good at. You can see here on this indicator, pretty good at creating plans. It's just stress testing they were not so good at as a group as a whole. And so they were going to work together as a group to break down the silos using their ability to partner, and then they were going to spend time stress testing those plans together to improve the quality and ability to deliver those plans. Great idea, great capacity, and made a big difference in terms of their organizations. In effect, they decided they were going to practice resilience as a team sport. Now I can see my 30 minutes is starting to run, so I'm just going to skip through a few slides so there's time for discussion at the end. One of the key points I want to make is these 13 indicators, they're not all equal. The 5 that you see in red, the 5 that you see in the red circles are without question the most potent. We've discovered this by both survey and through in-depth studies with organizations in Christchurch following the earthquakes. Leadership's the most important. It enables all the rest. The others, staff engagement, effective partnerships, situation awareness and innovation creativity, far more important than the others. And yet the others are also important, but they're more the supporting cast. In the study that our colleagues in our business school that we work with conducted on what makes organizations more resilient, It was a study of organizations after the 2010-11 Canterbury earthquakes for you to have some feel for how impactful these earthquakes were. It resulted in a 20% loss of 20% of the New Zealand GDP was the earthquake losses. That's massive. If that happened in the US, we'd be talking about a $4 trillion loss as a result of some individual event. The study was done with 11 infrastructure organizations with the purpose of developing best practice management and organizational processes for becoming more resilient. The key outcome, which I'll just jump to here, was that there were 4 key elements. And they were pretty much the same 4 key elements of the 5 that we had, which was leadership type, employee engagement, so valuing your employees, collaboration, which is your networking and partnering, and learning organization, so your ability to innovate and create fresh ideas to move the organization forward. Some robust support for our 13 indicator model, and the organizations that followed this path came out far better in post earthquake Christchurch. So with that, just touching on some of the resources, then I'll stop and we'll have a time for some discussion and questions. Some resources available from our website. You can see our website here, www.resorgs.org.nz. The booklets part, we have a set of resources there for free download. We would be happy to collaborate, which we have done with organizations in Australia, Latin America, and New Zealand to co-produce a version of the booklet that's co-branded. If you wanted to put your branding and then distribute in some of your communities, we'd be very happy to collaborate in doing that. If you go to that website, though, you'll find this booklet called Building Adaptive Resilience, which takes that study I just described and provides more advice around it. Another booklet that we've used just recently, because there was a big earthquake, you might have seen the news, in the upper part of the South Island, which has affected our nation's capital in Wellington, as well as having a very strong impact on our rural communities. Tourism's a big issue, big part of the economy here, and we've made these booklets freely available to businesses and organizations in those impacted areas, both through our website, but also printing at our own cost for distribution to small businesses and NGOs in the region. Striving Through. It is a booklet for for any organization that is now in the middle of a crisis. It just happened today, and you haven't done any preparation. What do I do now? What do I do today in the next 24 hours? What should I do this week, this coming month, in order to make sure that we survive this crisis and then learn to thrive in an uncertain world? Now, with that, I'll stop. This is my email address here, john.vargo@resorgs.org.nz. Maybe I will put that into the chat box so that you've got access to it. And then you'll be able to contact me if you have any questions or want access to further resources. But I'll stop. I've probably talked longer than intended, and happy to respond to any questions that you have. I see there was one here from Taylor. Might be good for some and not good for others. Now, I'm not quite sure what you mean, Taylor. Do you want to just give me a little bit more of a steer on that, and I'll do my best to answer it. And while you're putting that into the text box, I'll add my email address.
Well, John, thank you. I see we have John, there's a question there from John Gulick.
Sure, let me just see there's my email address. Make sure I've typed that in right. Yeah, resorgs.org.nz, that's good. John, great overview. Could I share your contact information with a group of community development practitioners that are putting together a pre-conference for Community Development Society conference in June? You sure can. Be happy to respond to them, and myself or one of my colleagues come if they wanted one of us to come. And leading the effort, Jim Cavey. I haven't met Jim, but I look forward to it. So thanks for your comment, John. I'm happy to respond to any questions also.
Well, while we're waiting for John to type there, I just was on a call on a different issue, and one of the things that popped up is that we have some pretty big, sort of crises in the financial issues in farming right now, and here in Michigan, we've had several fairly not several, but at least a couple, three, four high-profile farmers who are partners with Michigan State University either attempt or commit suicide, and it seems to me that the underlying situation for those large businesses was such that they weren't terribly resilient to a financial shock. And oftentimes this is the case, right, where in farming or in other areas we have these commodity price swings which can really have a big impact on the viability of an organization. I'm just wondering if you could comment or your thought on that in that context.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Mark. We did a study 6 years ago on the impact of disasters on the rural sector in New Zealand. It included post our earthquakes, but also there was a 50-year snowstorm that followed our first earthquake within a month and had quite a damaging impact. I know snow for you guys is no big issue, but in New Zealand we don't get a lot of snow, and you get a foot of snow or a foot and a half of snow, and it can be devastating at the wrong time of the year. And this did happen the wrong time of the year. And so we've discovered some things about the rural community and financial collapse. We saw this in the 1980s in New Zealand when the interest rates, which were government controlled at 11%. I know it sounds high now, but you have to remember what the interest rates were like in the 1970s and 80s. Hyperinflation was the norm. Inflation rates were 15 to 25%, and interest rates were above that. Well, interest rates in New Zealand in the mid-1980s went from 11% to 25% in a period of about 6 months because the government removed the controls that were keeping it low at 11%. Inflation at the time was running at 18 to 20%. So as soon as they removed the controls, the interest rates went through the roofs. We had exactly the same thing happening with New Zealand farmers as you just described. A lot of suicides, people walking off their farms and walking away from them. Marital failure as a result of those pressures. And so it's huge. Are there things that can be done about it? There are. Some of them obviously have to be done far enough in advance. So it requires some foresight. So conservatism around debt borrowing, having a reasonable spread of products that you supply. Now, of course, that runs contrary to efficiency. If you're a corn farmer, it's more efficient to have a single product on your farm. It's true, but it means it's more risky. And that's exactly what you're talking about here. When things go bad financially, it's because the risk finally arrived. But there are other specific things. If you haven't done that kind of planning, there are things like your services may already be doing. And that's providing specific support for those farming communities when the crisis starts to unfold. Some of you be familiar with the concept of social capital. Social capital is the connections between people that provides the opportunity and the channels of resources from those who are not being so badly hit to those who are. In some cases, that social capital may just be social support and moral support for the people. In other cases, maybe friends gathering around and helping subsidize their position until they can improve, or helping them think through a trajectory out of their problem, which may mean walking off the farm still, but arriving at the other end with their marriage and their life still intact. So there are some quite specific things that can be done. I know they do it in New Zealand, and I assume they probably do it in the U.S. as well, with rural support trusts, is what they call them in New Zealand, which include psych support and other types. However, part of the problem with the rural community in general is that they're very resilient and robust on the one hand, in that they look after them. That they're tough. When something bad happens, they just tuck in and they do what they have to. The Problem is when you have something that's really strong like that, it can be rigid. And when you reach the breaking point, uh, there may not be it may be very difficult to recover from it. And so becoming flexible is an important feature in the process of building resilience. And that's something that can be taught, and it can be taught in advance. The willingness to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling, I need help. But as humans, we tend not to do that. So there are some specific things that can be done to support rural businesses in crisis. Some of them need to be done in advance, but there are some things that can be done immediately. No question about it,
Yeah.
Mark.
Well, thank you, John. I think we're just about just a little past our typical time, and we have John Gulick who's hanging with us. But maybe now's a good time to close off the webinar.
Sounds like it to me. Nice talking with you, Mark. John, thanks for hanging in there to the bitter end. I hope we'll have more.
Thanks a lot, John. We really appreciate it, and I hope that we can share some more of this information with some of our partners, and the link will be available as well for other people who couldn't make it at this time.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, we'll talk with you soon.
Cheers.
Bye.